Welcome back to the deep dive.
Something that's been on my mind lately is the U.S. federal deficit and debt.
Oh, yeah. Definitely a hot topic, and it seems like it gets more and more complex every day.
It really does, and that's why we're doing a deep dive today into a Congressional Research Service report.
Oh, cool.
It's called Deficits, Debt, and the Economy, an introduction.
Catchy.
So we want to make sure that you understand this complex topic and just how much of an impact it can have.
Yeah, because it affects literally every single one of us.
It really does. In fact, get this, in 1946, the U.S. debt was a massive 119% of GDP.
Wow.
I mean,
That's a lot higher than it is today.
It is. Today, that same dollar amount would only be 1% of GDP.
Hmm.
So what do you make of that?
Well, it really highlights how the value of money changes over time and how economic growth can, shrink the relative size of debt.
Right.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, we should define some terms, right? Like, what is a budget deficit?
Yeah, and how's it different from the federal debt? Okay, so think of it this way. A budget deficit is kind of like overspending your monthly budget.
Okay.
It happens when the government spends more money than it takes in through taxes and other revenue sources.
Makes sense.
The federal debt, on the other hand, is the total amount of money the government owes.
To its creditors, right?
Exactly. It's basically like the accumulation of all the past deficits.
So is that kind of like a credit card balance that keeps growing?
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. And just like a credit card, the U.S. government has different types of debt.
Oh, really?
The report actually breaks it down into two main categories:
Oh, eh?
debt held by the public and intragovernmental debt.
Okay, so debt held by the public is what we usually think of when we hear the term national debt, right?
Right, exactly. That's the result of the government borrowing money from people, businesses, and even foreign governments
So how do they do that?
by issuing treasury bonds, securities, things like that.
Okay, so if publicly held debt is like owing money to friends and family, what is this intragovernmental debt all about?
So intragovernmental debt is a little bit more like borrowing from your own savings account.
Hmm,
It happens when one part of the government owes money to another part.
interesting.
A big example is the Social Security Trust Fund, where surplus payroll taxes are invested in treasury securities.
Ah, I see. So both of those represent debt, but they have different kind of implications.
Definitely.
Public debt is traded on the open market and can affect things like interest rates. Intergovernmental debt is more of an internal accounting matter.
Right.
Now, the report mentions that as of September 30th, 2022, the total federal debt was over $30 trillion,
Yikes.
with a majority, about 78%, being publicly held. That's a lot of debt.
It is. And that brings us to, I think, a really crucial point: this relationship between deficits and debt. The report calls it a two-way street.
Interesting. What do they mean by that?
Well, it makes sense that if the government keeps running deficits and spending more than it brings in, that the total debt will just keep growing, right? But there's a little more to it than that. There's like a cyclical effect at play here.
Okay, so how does that work?
Okay, so think about it like this. When the government needs to finance a deficit, they got to borrow money, right?
Right.
How do they do that? They issue those treasury securities that we were just talking about.
Right.
And that, of course, increases the public debt.
Right. But then that debt comes with interest payments.
Exactly.
And as the debt grows, those interest payments become a bigger part of government spending, which can then, in turn, fuel even more deficits in the future.
Exactly. It's a self-perpetuating cycle.
So larger deficits lead to more debt,
Yeah.
which leads to higher interest payments, which can then lead to even larger deficits down the line.
Exactly.
Kind of makes you want to check your own credit card balance, doesn't it?
For sure. And the report actually shows this visually in Figure 1. It shows the historical growth of federal debt since 1973. It's kind of a stark reminder of just how persistent this issue has been.
It's not new.
Nope. And if you look at the breakdown, it's clear that publicly held debt has been the primary driver of that overall increase.
Hmm. So what do you think that means for policymakers who are grappling with this debt?
Well, it suggests that controlling the publicly held debt, that money the government owes to, like, outside lenders, is crucial.
Right. But that raises a whole other set of questions like, what are the economic consequences of all this borrowing? Does it help or hurt the economy in the long run?
Those are the questions that keep me up at night.
Me too.
Oh.
And those are the questions that we're going to be addressing in the next part of this deep dive.
Can't wait.
Okay, so we just finished talking about that tricky cycle of deficits and debt, and now I'm really curious about the economic consequences. I know the report dives into some different perspectives on this. Is there a simple answer to whether deficits and debt help or hurt the economy?
If only economics were that straightforward. There are different schools of thought on this, and the impacts really can vary a lot depending on the context.
Okay.
For example, have you ever heard of the term crowding out?
Yeah, I have. Honestly, the first thing I think of is a crowded concert venue. Too many people, not enough space. Is that kind of the same idea?
Uh-huh. Yeah, you're actually not far off.
Okay.
In economics, crowding out refers to the idea that when the government borrows a lot of money
Right.
to finance its deficits, it can actually drive up interest rates.
Okay.
And higher interest rates make it more expensive for businesses to borrow money.
For things like expansion.
Exactly. Or for hiring new employees.
So the government's borrowing ends up crowding out that private investment and potentially slowing economic growth in the long run.
That's the idea.
But hold on, I thought government spending could actually stimulate the economy, especially during like a recession.
Right.
Doesn't that contradict the whole crowding out idea?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it highlights the complexity of this issue.
Yeah.
You're right, government spending can be a really powerful tool to boost demand when the economy is struggling.
Yeah, especially during a downturn.
Yeah. Think of it this way. When the economy is in a slump, businesses and consumers tend to cut back on spending, right?
Right.
Which further depresses economic activity.
Makes sense.
But the government can step in because they have the ability to borrow and spend.
Right.
And they can fill that gap in spending and kind of stabilize the economy.
So it's kind of like a jump start for a stalled car.
Yeah, exactly.
Temporary boost to get things moving again.
Yeah, but the key word there is temporary.
Right.
While deficit spending can be beneficial in the short term, the long-term impact of debt on economic growth really depends on how those borrowed funds are used.
That makes sense. So if the government is investing in things that boost productivity and create long-term value, things like infrastructure, education, or scientific research, that's one thing. But if the borrowing is used to just fund consumption or inefficient programs,
Yeah,
that might not be as beneficial in the long run.
exactly. And it's important to remember that debt levels can't rise indefinitely, right? They're constrained by investors' willingness to lend, and perceptions matter. If investors start to lose confidence in a government's ability to manage its debt,
Oh, yeah?
they might demand higher interest rates or even refuse to lend altogether.
Wow.
And that can lead to a real fiscal crisis.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not just about like the raw numbers. It's also about like market psychology,
Yeah,
investor confidence.
absolutely.
I'm thinking about the report where it mentions Greece and Japan.
Yeah,
Both of those countries have high levels of debt, but they've experienced very different economic outcomes.
very different.
Why is that?
Well, so Greece had a sovereign debt crisis back in the 2010s
Right?
because investors lost confidence in their ability to repay its debts.
Okay.
Japan, on the other hand, has managed to maintain investor confidence despite having a really high debt-to-GDP ratio.
Interesting.
And there are several reasons for that. Japan has a high savings rate, and a lot of its debt is held domestically.
So context matters.
Yeah.
It's not just about the level of debt, but it's about a country's economic fundamentals, the structure of its debt, and how investors perceive all of that.
Exactly. It's not a simple equation.
It really sounds like navigating this fiscal landscape requires like a really delicate balancing act.
It does.
Speaking of balancing acts, the report mentions something called automatic stabilizers.
Yeah.
Can you remind me what those are and how they fit into all of this?
Absolutely. So automatic stabilizers are features of the tax and spending system that automatically work to dampen economic fluctuations, almost like shock absorbers.
Okay.
They kick in during recessions and ease back during bends.
Ah, right. So for example, during a recession, unemployment benefits automatically increase
Right.
as more people lose their jobs.
Exactly.
That provides a safety net and helps to support spending.
Yeah. And on the flip side, during an economic expansion, tax revenues naturally rise as incomes grow. So that helps to moderate the boom and reduce the deficit. So these automatic stabilizers act as a kind of built-in countercyclical force.
Okay, so they help to smooth out the business cycle.
Right.
But if I remember correctly, you also mentioned that these stabilizers can have a bit of a downside when it comes to like long-term debt management.
That's true. While they're essential for short-term economic stability, they can make it harder to achieve long-term deficit reduction.
Why is that?
Well, think about it. These stabilizers naturally lead to higher deficits during recessions.
When tax revenues fall.
Right. And spending on safety net programs increases.
Right.
And even though deficits tend to shrink during expansions, it can be difficult to make up for the ground that was lost during the downturns.
Yeah. So Policymakers are faced with this dilemma of trying to balance the need for that short-term economic stability with the long-term goal of fiscal sustainability.
It's a tough job.
It's a tough balancing act. Knowing what we know now about deficits and debt, I'm curious about what can be done to address these challenges. And I know that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in the next part of the deep dive.
Yes, get ready for some potential solutions.
So we've explored deficits, we've explored debt, the consequences, and automatic stabilizers. Now I'm curious what can actually be done to address this.
Yeah, that's the trillion-dollar question, right?
It is.
Considering the scale of the U.S. debt, policymakers really have two main levers to pull: spending cuts and revenue increases.
Okay, let's break those down. What kind of spending cuts are we talking about here? Like slashing essential services?
Not necessarily. There are a few different areas policymakers could target. One is discretionary spending.
Right.
Things like defense, education, transportation, scientific research. These are all programs that Congress allocates funding for each year.
So unlike things like Social Security and Medicare, which have funding determined by formulas, discretionary spending is more flexible.
Exactly. But even within discretionary spending, there are tons of essential services and investments that contribute to society.
Right, so it's not just about making cuts across the board. Policymakers need to really carefully weigh the benefits of deficit reduction against the costs of those reduced services and investments.
For sure. It's a tough balancing act.
It is. What about the other side, revenue increases?
Well, the most direct way to increase revenue is through taxes.
Okay.
It could involve raising tax rates on individuals or corporations, or broadening the tax base,
Okay.
eliminating deductions or loopholes, things like that.
I can already hear people groaning at that.
Right. Tax increases are never popular, but they are a really powerful tool for reducing deficits
Right.
and stabilizing those debt levels.
Mhm.
But of course, there are a million different perspectives on how to design a fair and efficient tax system.
That's probably a whole other deep dive.
Yeah, for sure.
It strikes me that both spending cuts and revenue increases could impact different people in different ways.
Absolutely, that's a crucial point. For example, cuts to social safety net programs could disproportionately affect lower-income households,
Right.
whereas tax increases on higher earners might have a bigger impact on investment and economic growth. So policymakers have to be very mindful of these trade-offs and try to find solutions that are both fiscally responsible and equitable.
Yeah, it sounds like there's no easy answers when it comes to this debt challenge.
Not at all.
Thinking about the bigger picture, how does the U.S. debt situation affect the global financial system?
So that's a really great question. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency.
Right.
So that means it's widely used for international transactions.
Okay.
And held as like a safe haven asset by central banks all around the world. So if investors start to question the long-term stability of the US economy and its ability to manage its debt, it could undermine confidence in the dollar.
Right.
And that could lead to instability in global markets.
So the stakes are really high. The report also emphasizes those long-term debt projections, which are pretty concerning.
Definitely. The CBO projects that under current law, U.S. debt held by the public could reach 185% of GDP by 2052,
Wow.
which would be historically unprecedented in the United States.
And those projections are assuming things stay relatively stable. Any kind of unexpected shocks, a pandemic, global conflict, who knows, could make things even worse.
It really does feel like we're walking a tightrope. We have to be super mindful of the risks and actually take steps to address this.
Right. It feels like there's a real sense of urgency to this.
Right.
We can't just keep ignoring it and pass it on to the next generation.
I completely agree. We need a serious national conversation about fiscal responsibility and long-term sustainability. We need to look past partisan politics and find some common ground.
And that's where an informed public comes in. This deep dive has hopefully given our listeners a better understanding of these complex issues and how important it is to make thoughtful policy choices.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. The more you understand about this, the better equipped you'll be to participate in conversations about our collective future.
Well said. That's it for today's deep dive into deficits and debt. Thanks for joining us.